Good morning. So, if you're listening to this, you probably have at least some interest in mindfulness. And anybody who listens to this channel might know I'm not really into the idea of retreat. It's not something that I really want to do. Retreat meaning a mindfulness retreat. I don't see that as a goal of my practice right now. And what I'd like to recommend for those of you who are practicing secular mindfulness but something that's worth doing, which is very much the opposite of the idea of retreat. A retreat, whether you're doing it on your own or in groups or what have you, is you're going into a controlled environment, which is very closed, it's warm. I don't mean warm in the temperature sense, it's warm in the sense that it should be supportive. It's very supportive of mindfulness practice. It's not, in that respect, like the real world. The real world. It's not like the outside world typically is. And I think that when people do walking meditations or things like that, there's a bit of a tendency to shy away from doing it in places that are somewhat unpleasant or in environments that are somewhat unpleasant. So people will walk in a meditation hall, they'll walk in the forest, they'll walk in a field. And that's all fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, and I think that it's good, but I do think there's a benefit to going out into a city. The reason I say this is because cities have very often, if you open your eyes and look, a lot of things that we normally have aversion to. They have suffering, right? Other people's. If you live in Denver, it's cold, which I do, and in the winter at least it's cold, and that's actually a very good way to practice discomfort. It's a very safe way to practice being uncomfortable, is you go outside, you take your jacket off, you take your gloves off, and you sort of hang out with your discomfort for a bit, and you note it. You note it softly. You don't have to note it with a lot of aggression or anger. And you can notice the tone of that too in your own mind. It's like, it's cold. Is it just cold, like with, no color? Or is it cold, like I'm freezing and I would really like to put my jacket back on? I think seeing the suffering of other people in cities is a very valuable practice because it's going to happen, and ignoring it, which is the sort of standard city behavior as far as I can tell, is you're training your mind to ignore the suffering of other people. Even if you're not going to do something about it, meaning if you see somebody sleeping outdoors in the winter, they're asleep. They haven't asked you for help. And you're not necessarily a social worker or something like that. You may not be equipped to help. But there's a value, I think, to observing it, taking note of it, noticing how you feel when you see other people suffering. Do you feel an urge to help? Do you feel an urge to run away, right? Is there an aversion there? Are you looking to avoid this stimulus? Or are you looking to distract yourself? Do you find that you can accept it calmly, kind of like other people are suffering? It doesn't help for you to suffer because somebody else is. This is one of the things that I think can be learned from mindfulness and Buddhism that's valuable in a secular context too. Observing the suffering in the world doesn't mean you have to take it on. And I sometimes see people, I'm not saying this exclusively, I'm just talking about people my age. I'm in my late 20s. And you will see people, they'll observe some form of suffering out there in the world, and it rips them up inside. And the thing is that you don't have to do that. It's not a choice, but you don't have to do it. There is a way to train your mind to look at suffering, observe it, notice that you want to help, and not let it tear you apart. And that can be a controlled way of dealing with it. I think the practice of noting, which if you're not familiar with the sort of mindfulness or Buddhist practice of noting, it's that you sort of note something coming into the mind. So if there's a color to something, you walk past a storefront, and this is actually also a good thing to do in cities. You walk past a storefront and you see a muffin or something like that, and you notice a craving happen. You note it. You label it. You give it a name. And you say, okay, craving, right? And then you keep walking, right? If you're walking, which I was. And as you go past that thing, if you find yourself continuing to think about it, you go, oh, okay, craving. And you keep doing it. And eventually what you'll find is it tends to stop. And the last thing I think that's valuable to do outside, especially in an urban environment, is transience. You can meditate on transience, temporariness, whatever you want to call it. It's the nature of things not being permanent. Impermanence is the sort of more formal Buddhist term. So you walk, your hands get cold, right? Your hands get cold. Before you put them in your pockets, one thing you can try is just be like, why does this bother me? This is an impermanent state. My hands are not always going to be cold. See if it changes the nature of your experience with regards to the discomfort. You know, you're walking and maybe you're doing this first thing in the morning, right? A lot of people like to meditate in the mornings if they can. I think it's a good way to start the day, but it doesn't mean that that's when you're doing it. But let's say you get a little hungry, right? You walk past the storefront, that craving kicks in. You notice, hey, maybe I'm a little bit hungry, right? And you can do the same thing. Normally, would this cause you to just react and walk into a store and buy a stack? You can sort of look at it and go like, okay, I'm hungry. Does this bother me? First of all, it might not bother you, right? You might be one of these people you're good at sitting with your hunger, or walking with it, right? But you can also look at it and just go, okay, I'm hungry. This is not a permanent state. It's impermanent. And see if that changes. Because you're not going to be hungry. If you are in the Western world and you're okay financially, which I hope you are, the chances of you staying hungry permanently, involuntarily, are rare. I'm not saying you're going to have access to the best food in the world, but chances are you're not going to be hungry all the time. So it's an impermanent state, and you can note it. You can sort of go, okay, this is impermanent. Quick edit. I realized watching this that I missed something which I had felt a need to talk about, which is another thing you can do in city environments, in urban environments, which is practice acceptance. So this is not so different from noting, in my opinion, acceptance is just the opposite of noting aversion, right? Something's happening, you don't like it, you want it to be different. You note the aversion, sometimes that's enough. You note that you don't want it. But you can also deliberately try to practice accepting things. And what that looks like or feels like or sounds like is you're walking, you're cold, right? That's a good example, you're uncomfortable. And rather than just noting, hey, I'm cold, right? That's noting. So that's awareness, but it's not necessarily doing something skillful to deal with it. You could put your hands in your pocket too. I'm not saying you need to walk around miserable all the time, but you're cold and you sort of go, okay, I'm cold. It's a different feeling than just noting cold. I think it feels different to me, is that there's noting that you're cold and then there's accepting that you're cold. You're just like, I am going to be cold for a while until I put my hands away. And resolving that you're going to be okay with it, sort of. You just decide, as it were. And this doesn't always work, obviously. And it may not work the first time you try it, or the second time you try it, or the third time you try it, or the 100th time you try it. One of the things about acceptance practice is you can do it pretty much all of the time. You can sort of just go, or you go sit on a park bench in the cold, right? So it's sort of uncomfortable, or on a stone ledge. That's a good example, right? You're sitting. And you're like, this is a little bit painful. Okay. It's going to be a little bit painful. I'm going to sit anyway. For a minute. For half a minute. You just give yourself a time frame. So what it actually boils down to, the three things I think that are good to practice in a city. There's noting, there is acceptance, and there's specifically noting the transient nature of pretty much anything you're doing. Transience and acceptance come together, I think, also. If you note that something is transient, very often you'll accept that it will eventually pass, and then that makes it easier to deal with. Hopefully that helps those of you living in a city kind of practice mindfulness in a different way. It doesn't always have to be seated in your living room. So, yeah. Have a good day.
Thank you for watching. If you like this video, go ahead and hit that like button. If you found it useful, please consider subscribing so that you can see more content like this. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them down below. Have a good one.